Hi, I'm Anthony Ward and welcome to the second part in our virtual actress tutorial. In part 1, we created the model for our virtual actress. We also UV'd her, applied textures. I showed you a couple of tricks to create various hairstyles quickly and also various clothing quickly. We also then went on and added in some lighting into a scene and created a basic photo shoot setup so she was ready to render. The problem now is she's pretty static. She's more like a statue really. So what we're going to do in this course is add in a skeleton and a rig which will allow us to pose her, and we'll also add in blend shapes which will allow us to give her facial expressions so she can show emotion. So we're going to start off with just a basic scene. I've stripped out all the fancy shaders, all the lighting and everything. I've also removed the hair and clothing because the base model is what we're focusing on at the start of this tutorial. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a skeleton. We're going to build a skeleton which will fit inside her body. We can then bind this model to the skeleton, and that will then allow us to pose the model. So first of all, let's start creating our skeleton. And to do this, make sure you're in your animation menu. Go to skeleton and open up your joint tool. Just scale this down so we can look at the options. So there are lots of options in here. These options, the degrees of freedom, that basically will limit which way your joint can rotate. So if, for example, your elbow joint, you may only want it to rotate around the y-axis because your elbow doesn't physically rotate around the other axes. For now, we're just going to stick with the default settings, but I'll just give you a quick run through. So degrees of freedom we'll leave as they are because we want all the joints to be able to rotate in any axis. This here sets the axes of each joint. Your primary axis, secondary axis. Basically, the primary axis is which axis points down the bone, so which one is pointing from one joint to another. We'll leave that as X for now. And the secondary axis is which axis attempts to point straight up. So the world orientation obviously is Y, so we'll leave that at Y as well. So we basically want the X-axis to point down the bone, we want the Y-axis to point up, and the world axis, which it should align with, well, as it says there, is Y as well. Obviously you can have plus or minus, or a positive or negative value. We'll leave everything else here. If you're using Maya 2013 but the upgraded extension version, you'll have this symmetry option here. Now I'm not going to use this just in case you're using an older version of Maya, but what I'll do is I'll just quickly demonstrate it. So we just want to mirror across the x-axis, and then let's just switch to our front view. Just move this over here so we can see what we're doing. Just press Ctrl and space just so we can get a full view here. So now we're mirroring across the x-axis. If we place a joint for the arm, for the elbow, for the wrist, you can see it's creating the ones opposite too. And also if we move these or rotate these, it's going to mirror that there too as well. But obviously we're not going to use that tool just now. So let's just bring back our options. Oops, let's just pull that off there. There we go. So we'll turn off symmetry for now, but that's a useful tool there just in case you want to speed up your workflow and create both halves at the same time. So let's just reset that tool. We're going to leave everything at the default settings and we're just going to start building our skeleton. Now I like to start with the limbs first. The centre of the body is pretty standard. And what we're looking at is getting the joints in the centre of the mesh. Now in May 2014 there's a nice tool going to be included which will automatically find the centre of the model for you. So you won't need to check the front, check the top and adjust the joints that way. But for us, unfortunately, we need to do that. So let's put our shoulder joint about here. And what else we're going to do is we're going to add in extra joints for the bicep. And we're going to create one for the elbow. And we're going to create another joint for the wrist rotate, and then we'll go down to the wrist like so. Now I'm not going to show you me placing every joint. I'm pretty sure you can manage that yourselves. Let's just make sure X-ray joints is on. And what we might want to do is turn on wireframe on shaded, just so we can get an idea of where it is. Now these joints need to be exactly in the middle, so what I'm going to do is just check that there's only a value on the translate X, which is fine. You may want to just go to the front and just make sure when you rotate it doesn't wobble at the end like so. So you may need to just go in and tweak these just to make sure they're central. Now that is rotating nicely down to the elbow. So these here may just need slightly adjusting just to fix those. That's a bit better. So our rotation back to 0. So these joints we've added in because if you look at your own body and the way it deforms, it doesn't twist from the shoulder. When you actually twist your arm, it's almost as if it's twisting from this point here. And we don't want the mesh to deform up here when we twist. And if we didn't have this joint, it would be rotating around the x-axis on the shoulder, and you'd end up with some sort of nasty twisting here, and there'd be problems when you come to poser. Shoulder area is always an issue. So we add this bicep joint in here, and what we'll do, but later on when we come to rigor, is this joint, we use the z-axis and the y-axis as it should, but when we rotate the x, we'll trick this rig into actually rotating this joint. So it'll rotate around the biceps here. The same goes on with the wrist. If you twist your wrist, you'll see you can move your wrist around that axis, you can move it around the y-axis, but when you rotate around the x-axis, it doesn't twist around this point here, it twists around this point here. And that's because the radius and ulnar bones, which both come down the upper arm, the forearm here, they actually rotate around each other, and that's what creates that twist. So it's always a good idea, if you can afford the joints, to add in these extra couple here, but make sure they're bang on central. So double check and triple check that when you're rotating, that there's no wobbling at the ends there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause the video, add in the rest of the skeleton. Actually, tell a lie, I'm going to delete this one, and I'm going to bring up one that I made earlier. Here we go. If you're looking at this myosine, it's in this group fix axis, and you'll see why it's called that in a second. So let's turn off the wireframe. So here we've created all these joints for the fingers. We have our bicep and wrist twist. We have a root node there, and for the feet I've just made a basic joint here just to get the ball of the foot rotating, just so we can move the toes up and down. If you feel that you need to, you can go in and add in extra joints for each individual toe. What I've also done, added in a joint for the jaw so that we can have her mouth opening and closing, and we have the head joint here which points out to where she's looking. It's also important to have your clavicle joints, because when you raise your arm doesn't raise to that point. If you raise your arm now, you'll see if you try and raise it without shrugging your shoulder, you can only really raise it to about this point here before it starts to get difficult, and then that's where the clavicle takes over, and that's how your arm naturally rotates. So it's important to have that clavicle joint in too. So this is the skeleton. We've placed all the joints, we've kept them down the centre of the model, just to keep the deformation right. For the spine, for example, if we kept that at the back of the body here, when she bent forward, the front here would collapse in far too much. So it's nice to keep it down the centre. So the problem we have now, as we can see here, is the way it rotates. And what I'm going to do to demonstrate this further is open up our rotate tools and switch to gimbal. And this is showing us exactly what the rotation of each joint is going to do. So if we rotate Z, we can see that X and Y rotate with it. Rotate X, nothing else rotates with it. Rotate Y, and X rotates with that. And that's because of the rotation order on the joints, but we'll come to that in a second. But as you can see, because of the axis of this joint, if we come to rotate the Y joint, that doesn't really rotate properly. We rotate the X joint and the arm goes a bit funny. Now by default, as we saw in the settings, Maya will try to point the axes correctly. What I've done is I've purposefully gone in and reset all the axes on this skeleton just to demonstrate. So how do we look at these rotational axes? So select the root joint, go to Edit, select Hierarchy, then we're going to go to Display, Transform Display, Local Rotational Axes. Just make sure they're all, that's it. So here we can see where these axes are pointing. X is just pointing out, Z, they're basically just copying the real world axes, and that's because I reset them. We want them to point down the bone, Y pointing up and Z pointing forward. So let's just hide the model for now. How do we reset these if for any reason they've been broken or there's something wrong with them in your model or you need to readjust them? So we just go to our skeleton Orient Joint tool. And as you can see here, it's pretty much the same as how it was when we were creating our joints. We have our primary axis, secondary axis world orientation. What you can do is once you've set this, so we're setting it back to its default, it will try to do the children of the selected joints. So if I apply it to, if I apply it here, it will also try and apply it down here. So let's just click apply. As you can see, X is pointing down the joint, Y is pointing up, and it's copied that right down to here. Now you need to check your wrist. And as you can see, we still want X to point directly forward, so we need to play around with that one a little bit more. So what we could do is maybe Orient Joint to the world, click apply, although that's done it to the children as well, so let's turn that off, click apply, and that's reset the joint, reset that orientation for us, but it's also sort of kept in mind the general orientation of where the joints are going and coming from. So now we've fixed that wrist so it's pointing straight down the hand, which is much better, just by orientating that joint to the world. So we now need to go in and just make sure these all rotate correctly. I mean, just looking at them, they do. The best thing to do, select a few and rotate and just see if that's exactly how your finger needs to rotate. Now the thumb, this is a bit different. If you look at where your thumb rotates, it doesn't just rotate up and down. We need it to rotate in sort of a 45-degree angle. Now we're not going to use the Orient Joint options for here. I've demonstrated that on the arm, and you just need to go through and fix them up for the rest of the body depending on how you want this character to rotate. I've also realised I've just skipped a bit. Okay, well we'll come back to that. Ignore the fact that this skeleton has both sides. In fact, I'm going to delete one side now because this is where you should be at. That's better. Right, getting sidetracked. So yeah, we want to fix the rotations on the thumb, and we're fixing the rotations now because we're going to mirror the joints across, so we need the rotations to be the rotational axes to be fixed. Right, so if we want to go in and edit these rotational axes individually, we can't just rotate the joints because the joints rotate too. Let's close that down. What we need to do is click on here, go over to our question mark, right click and select rotational axes. That will now allow us to go in, select those, and we can physically rotate them. As you can see, it's refusing to work for some reason. Let's have a look. Do them individually. Let's just make sure these aren't locked. Let's open up the attributes. Okay, just pause the video there while I tried to figure out what was wrong, and it was because we have this set to gimbal. If we set it back to local, that will allow us to then go in, select our rotational axes, and then we can rotate those. So now the thumb will rotate in that sort of 45-degree angle. You can undo that. If you see down here, we have a bit of mel script here. If we copy that, okay, let me just open up the script editor, just bring it down, let's try this. Copy that, paste it. If you see here, this is exactly what we did. We rotated it, but it was 36.487. If we want to rotate that an exact 45 degrees, we can just select that, change that to 45, press enter, and that's given us an exact value. So now if we go back into our thumb, that can rotate underneath the hand as it should. So there are a number of ways for editing your rotational axes. One other area I want to touch upon before we mirror the skeleton and end this first video is basically the rotation order, and we touched upon this earlier. If we set this to gimbal, this will demonstrate this nicely. So what we saw earlier was the beginnings of gimbal lock. If we rotate around the y-axis, if you see, X and Z become overlapping, so then you can't rotate these individually, and that's gimbal lock. If we rotate Z, sorry, Y and X rotate with it, so that's fine. Rotate X and nothing rotates with that. So you have to think about what is going to be the primary rotation for that particular joint. If we open up the attributes, you can see here we have rotation order, and we have these on everything, on every joint. You need to change this according to what it is, how it is you're going to rotate. So at the moment it's set to X, Y, Z, and it's sort of reversed. So Z will rotate Y and X as we saw. Y will affect X. So if we rotate Y, yep, that's true. So X doesn't affect anything. So in the case of the shoulder, we do want Z to control these two, because we lower the arm, we want the arm to move forwards and backwards. And twisting the arm, we want to be able to twist the arm wherever we want. So that kind of works okay for the shoulder. You may want to play around with these, and you may come up with a different option. As you can see, there's lots to choose from. You just need to make sure Z is the primary controller, really. Well, in this case Z is, because it's at the end of the list. So the elbow, for example, Y is going to be the primary rotation, so we need to put Y at the end. So maybe we try ZXY. So Y is now controlling Z and X, but we also want X to be secondary. Now there's no Z rotation really on the arm, unless you're doing some sort of funky rig where you've got that sort of degree of freedom. So maybe we want X to be last again. So YZX, so Y controls them all, Z controls X, X doesn't control any. So there, Y is our primary movement, so we've made that and changed the rotation order to show that. So that's basically it. You need to, at this stage, you go through, check your rotational axes just to make sure every joint rotates correctly, and then go in and adjust your rotation order on your main joints. Once you've done that, let's hide this guy and bring back our final skeleton. Let's just edit, select hierarchy. So here are our axes all fixed nicely. You'll see the spine is reset just because of the way it moves, and that's just a personal preference. Again, you can set that however you like. So let's get rid of the rotational axes now. What am I looking for? There we go. Right, so you've got one half of your skeleton, you need to create the other half. Now, presuming you haven't used that symmetry tool, what you first need to do, in fact, let's just delete some of these so that we can not sure what's happening there. I'm just going to pause the video while I get rid of one half of this skeleton. Not sure why deleting this hip removes the connection there. There we go, just unparented it and reparented it. Let's just hide that camera, it's in the way. So you've created one half of your skeleton. If I just bring the outliner over, as you can see, I've gone through and renamed all the joints so that they're named correctly. And what I've done is created a L underscore prefix onto each. And you'll see why I've done that in a second. It not only means that when I'm looking at the skeleton, I know which are the left-hand sides, which are the left side elements. It also means that when I come to mirror the joints, Maya will automatically rename everything which is L underscore to R underscore. So we don't need to go in and rename them ourselves. So how are we going to mirror this? So let's select our clavicle, select our hip, because these are the elements we want to mirror. I'm just going to go to skeleton, mirror joint, open up this. As you can see, we are replacement names for duplicate joints is what I've just mentioned. It's going to search for everything with L underscore and replace it with right underscore. You're going to mirror across which axis, so let's try XY. And the function depends on what you want the skeleton to do. Behaviour will mirror these joints, but it will also mirror the rotational axes. So let me just try that. So we have to do them one at a time. So click apply, and you see we've picked the wrong axis, so YZ. Click apply. There we go. And if you look at the axis here, Y is pointing up there, Y is pointing down there. If we select them both and rotate the Z axis, they both do move the opposite way. So depending on what you're doing or how you're going to animate, this may work well. But then if you're animating one side and you want to copy the animation across, this arm's going to do the opposite of this arm. So it comes down to what you're wanting to do. Let's just undo that. So if we try orientation, click apply, Y is pointing up there and Y is pointing up there as well. If we rotate this, it's going, this side is doing the opposite to this side, but it's kept the same orientation. So if we wanted to animate this side, the left side, and copy the animation across to this side, it should in theory work out okay. Or have I got those the wrong way around? It's basically kept the orientation, as you can see, which in some cases may not be right. Anyway, I like to have it set to behaviour. Click apply. As you can see, that looks much nicer. We've got the X, rather than pointing down the joint, it's pointing up the joint. So if you wanted to, you could mirror the joints, and then you could go in and you could use the Orient Joint tool to clean that up. Maybe try getting the joints pointing exactly how you want. But what's nice about this setup is we can select both arms and raise and lower them, move them forwards and backwards together. So you can essentially animate both sides at the same time just by using behaviour. And if we select that shoulder, close this down, you can see it's renamed it to right shoulder, left shoulder, right shoulder. So let's do the same on the leg. And just click mirror joint because we're just repeating what we did before. That should be parented. Oh, there we go. So there we have our full skeleton. We've gone in, we've built the skeleton, we've fixed the joint orientations, we've mirrored the left and right side, and then as a final test, select hierarchy, display local rotational axes. As you can see, mirroring them, it's also mirrored, using behaviour has also mirrored the axes. So depending on what you want to do, you may want to go in and refix those. So we can just go to skeleton, orient joint. So we want X down the bone. Let's just click apply. As you can see, X is now, Y is now pointing down. Let's reset that actually. Click apply. So there we've got Y pointing up, Y pointing up, X down the bone, X down the bone. So they're fine. Z is forward there, but then this is the opposite side, so Z is going to have to point backwards. But then we've still got this rotation here, but then we're going to sacrifice that rotation there. You see the arms are doing opposite. X works fine there. So it's down to personal preference how you want your skeleton set up. So there, it's up to you. You've got your skeleton built, you've checked the rotational axes, you've checked the rotation order. Just go through, double check everything's fine, and when you're absolutely happy with how your skeleton is going to rotate and deform, we can next think about how we're going to take this and attach it to our model to make our model move with the skeleton, and we'll do that in the next video.